Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, December 7th, 2022. And on this episode, using, of course, the words and wisdom and advice and strategy of the founders and old revolutionaries, I'm going to share with you what I see personally, and this could change from day to day, but as the top 5 threats to liberty that we face today. People like Franklin and Madison and Washington, Jefferson, Mason, Henry, and a few others. And I think if we're ever going to live in a real land of the free rather than this fake one in the empire, people, millions of them, tens of millions of people will absolutely have to start focusing their time, money, and energy on resisting these top 5 threats to liberty instead of putting all of it into, well, which person or team is going to continue running the largest government in history. Anyways, first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello, a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, I want to take a moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Missouri Freedom, Cheriton Farmer, Madman, Missouri Freedom Initiative, twice. Hi. President Merkin Muffley. I love that one. Brian in Georgia. Dixie Strong. Jonathan Shellman. Sharon Patriot, Alt Reality, Lisa Haji, Liberty Revolutionary, and everyone else. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. And I should mention that if you want to follow along, I've got a ton of original source documents that I'm going to be citing in this episode. You have to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty if you want to find them much easier than searching for each quote that I'm citing. That way you can read all of them and learn more in context on your own time. But let's get right to this. The top 5, and this is not in any order. And again, like I was saying, they could change from day to day. But I'm going to cite a few things that many of the founders and old revolutionaries told us were great threats to liberty, or the greatest threat to liberty, or the way that tyrants seize power and control people. And I want to start out with censorship, attacks on the freedom of speech. And here's a Benjamin Franklin, I think just 16 years old. Now, he didn't write this, but he was acting as publisher of the New England Courant in July of 1722. 16 years old, he made the decision that this was an important letter to publish in that paper, and he did it under the pen name of Silence Dogood. And he pointed out that whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. He didn't say free speech as a noun, but pointed out that if you want to overthrow liberty, they start by subduing, even just lessening the freeness of speech. That's in July of 1722. Here's Franklin again, and we're not 100% certain if he wrote this one either. This is on freedom of speech and the press in the Pennsylvania Gazette, November 17th, 1737. I guess I don't have to list all the dates while I'm blabbing here. It's kind of a habit, but here's how he put it. Freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved, and tyranny is erected on its ruins. So again, if freedom of speech is attacked, he recognized some years earlier when he was even younger that freedom of speech, the people who want to attack liberty, overthrow liberty, start out by subduing that, because all of their plans and programs, all the stuff that they do, and he wrote later on that all history informs us that there's always been kind of a war between the governed, the governing, and the governed. And so the way they do this is they start out against the freedom of speech through censorship. He points out that republics and limited monarchies derive their strength and vigor from a popular examination into the actions of magistrates. So if you can't have a popular, open discussion about the actions of what the people in power are doing, well, you can't be surprised that they use that power in ways that, well, you don't like, that are bad for liberty. Here's George Washington with a quote I'm sure most of you have heard. This was to the officers of the army, March of 1783. He said, if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind. So again, important issues of the day, if people are not free to share their viewpoint, and I know a lot of people are going to get into the whole side debate of, well, are you actually able to share things these days? Or maybe you don't get as much access. You have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. That's a different discussion. We're talking about the foundational principle here that if people want to continue controlling society, and if you think about the time when there were just 3 major TV networks, they certainly controlled the flow of information pretty easily at that time. So the more that it's decentralized, the more that there are more options, more availability, more access, the better society will be. So anyways, reason is, maybe I should read the whole thing over. So if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, wrote George Washington, which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep, to the slaughter. And this wasn't just a viewpoint of the founders and old revolutionaries. There was a long tradition in the people that they read and learned from talking about freedom of speech. And I think the best one from at least the founders' recipe, as my great friend Joe Wolverton calls it, the people that the founders learned from, is Cato's letters. This is Trenchard and Gordon back in the 1720s. Cato's letters number 15 was on freedom of speech. And this one was written by Thomas Gordon. And he started out with this: without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. The whole essay is really good. Of course, I will link to it in the show notes. But he continued with this: freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together. And it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them. So the first great threat to liberty, I think, that we face today is certainly, and have always faced, is censorship, attacks on the freedom of speech. Number 2 is war. And I think, of course, December 7th is a big day for that one as well. And for this one, I've got so many quotes, and I've done a number of episodes on the dangers of war, the dangers of standing armies from the founders and old revolutionaries. I want to focus primarily, solely on James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution. This was in his Political Observations paper, and he started out with this: of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War, he said, is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. So war leads to all the germs of every other problem that you can face. You get armies, and from armies you get debts and taxes, and that we have certainly a trifecta. Easy peasy. We have a massive trifecta when it comes to armies and debts and taxes. But it also leads to other things, like a consolidation of power in the executive branch. He said in war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. And we've seen this play out through our entire lives. Unless you're like covering your eyes and your ears, this has been happening since the day every single one of us were born. So number 2 is war. And of course, he said, I forgot to sum it up with this. He said, no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. That's all from his Political Observations paper on 4/20/1795. Number 3 is gun control. And certainly this one is a hot topic, and it should always be one. The right to keep and bear arms is a natural right. It's not a gift from government. It's not something that you should have to get a permission slip for. You get your permission slip by being born. But here's how St. George Tucker put it in the view of the Constitution of the United States. He said, this may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. So if the true palladium of liberty is the right of self-defense, if you attack it and take it away, then that is a great threat to liberty. So that's why I've listed this one as number 3. And again, this is not in any order. This may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. And Tucker, like so many of the other founders and old revolutionaries, he recognized that tying together the warfare state and gun control was really what tyrants absolutely love. Madison at another time pointed out that a great threat to liberty was a large permanent standing army. And this is what Tucker is talking about. He said, wherever standing armies are kept up, and when the right of the people to keep and bear arms is under any color or pretext whatsoever prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. Man, that should really hit home. Unfortunately, so many people who claim to support the right to keep and bear arms only support, well, they have no problem with so much that is on the books. Or if they want to get rid of all the federal and state gun control out there, they're okay, or they absolutely love standing armies. And Tucker, in and of himself, is pointing out, well, if you get a combination of these two, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction, and we are certainly there today. Here's Madison again from Federalist number 46. He noted that governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. Why? Because it's the true palladium of liberty. And if, as Benjamin Franklin pointed out, that there's always throughout history a war between the governing and the governed, if the palladium of liberty are things like freedom of speech, the right to self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms, well, then certainly government hates those things. And if war is a destruction of liberty, then government loves it. And so Madison points this out in Federalist 46, that governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. There's also Melancton Smith, most likely. We don't know for sure that he wrote this. A lot of people thought Richard Henry Lee wrote the anti-federalist Federal Farmer essays. It's almost certain he did not. I think most of the evidence points to Melancton, so we have him up here on the screen. The quote is, "To preserve liberty," and this is from Federal Farmer number 18, "to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms. So when that doesn't happen, you don't preserve liberty." And that hasn't happened for a long, long time. And if we're just thinking on a federal level, almost a century of federal gun control. And so many people are just ignoring the fact that the NFA of 1934 still exists, and they have not done anything to restrict that. It's only going to be up to the people in the states to get that job done. And while this is the type of essential information, we absolutely have to get this kind of thing out to more and more people. You can't rely on the government to limit its own power. When you do, the government keeps growing and growing and growing, no matter which team is in charge. We have to support the freedom of speech. We have to be opposed to the warfare state. We have to support the right to keep and bear arms. I've got a little bit more, but if you want to help us get this information out to more people, you can join us as a member today for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I wanted to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to a handful of people who've joined us recently as members. There's Joseph in California, Beverly in New Mexico, Mark in Iowa, Bobby in Arkansas, Hyacinth, I'm sorry if I get the name wrong or I pronounce that wrong, in Ohio, and Teresa in Oregon. I really, really appreciate your support. Don't feel any obligation to join them, but if you're able to, and if you've got a couple extra bucks of that dirty government fiat, I love calling it that, throw it our way. We'll use it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, no matter what the government has to say, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And with that, we're still on the right to keep and bear arms and the threat to liberty that is gun control. Here's Roger Sherman. In a debate in the House of Representatives, he said, "It is the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made." Wow. Resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made. So that should say so much right there. So number 3 is the right to keep and bear arms. The threat to liberty is gun control. And I think those of you watching the show, or if you've been here for any amount of time, that's a biggie as well. That should be a primary one. But Sherman's talking about property as well. So if you're talking about property and property rights, that was essential to the founding generation. Here's how Fisher Ames put it, and this is number 4, restrictions or attacks on property rights. Fisher Ames said, "To liberty, how can I be said to enjoy that which another may take from me when he pleases? And how much of our work today, our labor, our property is not really ours, because it's up to the government to determine how much of it we get to keep until it changes its mind and determines that it's going to take more. And it keeps taking more and more and more and more. And every now and then they'll grant us a little bit of relief, as if they're, giving us a gift from on high. But really, this happens in almost every state, every county, and especially on the federal level. They are ripping us off, and we don't really have liberty if they can just take from us what they please. And they take and take and take. And James Otis Jr., back in 1764, really brought it all the way down to the individual. He said, "No man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave." Man, that really hits, I think. James Madison, in his great essay on property in March of 1792, I think the other day I mentioned this essay just briefly. I had the date wrong. But here's how Madison put it: "Where an excess of power prevails, property of no sort is duly respected." So now we're transitioning into the next one, the last, number 5, which is centralization or consolidation of power. And the more that you have a centralization of power, the more that there's consolidation, I think, the more that we have all of these things. Of course, Madison points out that when you have too much power, they're not going to respect your property rights. So you're going to have restrictions on it. Of course, the more centralization of power, the more you're going to have a warfare state. The more centralization of power, the more easily they'll be able to have censorship and restrictions on free speech and restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms and pretty much anything and everything else. So consolidation or centralization of power. Here's how Brutus, the great anti-federalist writer, put it in his 4th paper: "Power lodged in the hands of rulers to be used at discretion is almost always exercised to the oppression of the people." I know most of you probably want to remove the word almost. I'm sure if we studied history, someone who had too much power probably did something that was good for the people. But the founders, especially the anti-federalists, really warned us against that type of thing. And a lot of people seem to set aside centralization or consolidation of power when their guy or their team does it. When they force their way on all 50 states, whether it's through the court system or through the executive branch or through laws passed in laws, I'm going to put quotes around that, passed in Congress, whatever it may be, as long as they get their political goals achieved in the short run, they ignore the fact that it's done through centralization of power. And when they can do that, the power you give them to do the things you like today is going to be in the hands of people who want to use that power to do stuff you hate in the future. So Brutus warned us that when you give them power to use the way they want to, they're almost always, especially in the long run, they're going to use it to oppress the people. George Mason warned about this as well. "I fear the thirst of power will prevail to oppress the people." George Mason certainly feared right. Thomas Jefferson, in his great letter to Joseph C. Cabell in 1816, he pointed out that, centralization, consolidation of power, putting all the decision-making into one group of people or into one power center, this is what destroys liberty. And he said, what has destroyed liberty in every government which has ever existed? Again, Jefferson with a little flair for the dramatic there, but he was certainly a student of history, better than almost every one of us today. The generalizing, this is the answer. What has destroyed liberty everywhere, all through history? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. And if we talk about living in this massive monster state where really, if you get down to it, they're telling us what kind of light bulbs we can buy, how big our toilet, they literally tell us there is a federal regulation on the size of your toilet or the amount of water that goes through it, what kind of plants you can grow and consume in your own home. You know, it all gets down to, well, what the feds give you permission to do or not do. And many of the worst things on a state or local level, and I'm going to be covering this more and more in some episodes in the next few days or in the next week or so, we're finding out that we've known this all along, but more and more of the worst state and local programs, the surveillance, the gun control, the prohibition, all that stuff tends to be funded by the central government. So even when your local people are doing horrible things, if you use the whole who benefits, follow the money, you know that there's some kind of federal grant program funding what they're doing. So centralizing all cares and power into one body destroys liberty in every government which has ever existed under the sun, according to Thomas Jefferson. And I think if it's between Jefferson and some political pundit on social media today, that's easy peasy. Jefferson wins every single time. Here's Patrick Henry. Also, he railed against power during the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And here's one quote that sums it up. He said, "Consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties." Again, consolidation must end. So the more they centralize power, and if we're talking about, I don't know, what is the federal budget on a year-to-year basis at this point? $5-6 trillion? I mean, this is not even remotely close to the decentralized constitutional system of the founders and ratifiers. If this is not a consolidated government, nothing on earth ever was or ever will be. And even though you and I have the ability to connect and communicate this way today, honestly, it's not really happening because we're free. It's happening because we're lucky. And John Dickinson talked about this in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. He asked, who are a free people? And a free people aren't those, and I'm just paraphrasing, aren't just those who happen to be living under a government that isn't happening to be violating their rights. And I think that's what's happening at this moment right now. Government is not stopping me from communicating with you at this moment. But in a situation of fear, a terrorist attack, you can be sure that government will come in and do that kind of stuff in the future. So it does have the capability and the power and the manpower and the guns to do that kind of stuff. Dickinson said the only way you're really a free people, and I agree with this absolutely, if you live in a situation that as soon as the government tries to get out of line, it's slapped back right into place. And we are nowhere close to that today. So Patrick Henry, Dickinson, so many others, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. And I do have one bonus. I just covered this a few weeks ago in November. Top 4 roadblocks to liberty is the episode. I will link to that in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Here's the TLDW, too long didn't watch. All of the top 4 are there's too much compliance. Because as long as people continue to comply with government acts, laws, orders, rules, and regulations, there's no reason for government to stop enforcing them, stop passing them, or continue, adding more to it. Anyway, so those are our top 5: censorship, war, gun control, restrictions on property rights, centralization, and consolidation of power. We have all of them, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. Let me see if I can answer some comments or questions over in the live chat. I also get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. So if you are not watching live and you want to leave a comment, please do so in the archive, or you can email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Let's take a look here. Don't comply, nullify. That's the great way to put it. I'm wearing the t-shirt that says, resist the first approaches of tyranny. That came from a letter by, or an essay by Mercy Otis Warren, The Conscience or Muse of the American Revolution. And that's a really important thing. We're supposed to resist the first approaches of tyranny, not wait for government or beg government to stop doing the stuff it wasn't supposed to be doing in the first place. And if we're talking about all these things, whether it comes from censorship and war and gun control and attacks on property rights, taxation is theft, printing, destroying the money, all that stuff, centralization of power, most people are just waiting to get the right people in office to then hopefully in a few decades get the right people on the courts and then get a lawsuit in. And by the time you're dead, maybe one issue has been turned around. But in the meantime, the monster state has grown even bigger and bigger and bigger. If you think about it, compare the size and scope of the government today or under the last administration with the size and scope of the government under the Clinton administration. You never would have thought in the 90s that that was a small government. But in comparison to now, that I think shows the absurdity of what we're facing, how bad it really is. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. Again, if you support the show and you want to help us get the word out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you want to join us and subscribe for as little as $2 a month. Otherwise, smash the like button, leaving comments, reviews on Apple Podcasts. All that will trigger algorithms and tell those platforms to show us to more people. I really appreciate you being here. I will see you next time on the path to liberty.